Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session of the course The History of English Language and Literature. In today's session we continue to look at the Elizabethan age. We also saw in the previous sessions how drama emerged as the singular most important feature of Elizabethan period, and also we noticed that Shakespeare was the most important figure and perhaps the best known dramatic product and the best known literary product of the Elizabethan times. In today's session, we continue to look at a few other genres, especially poetry and prose, and this session is important in order to try and understand that Elizabethan age not just was about drama and dramatic techniques and theatre, but it was also about a foundational age which laid the foundations for all kinds of genres which were to become popular in the later centuries. So, just a quick reminder that the Elizabethan age refers to the rule of Queen Elizabeth from 1558 to 1603. So, moving on, we begin to take a look at what constituted the Elizabethan poetry. Talking about the Elizabethan period and Elizabethan poetry, the kind of poetry that this age produced was very different from that of the medieval period. But however, there was a certain continuity which was built into the kind of productions that it almost seemed as if the medieval values and medieval history was continuing into the Elizabethan times. But at the same time, the outlook was radically different. It was more modern. There was the effect of Renaissance. There was the implications of Reformation. And so, we do not find the Elizabethan writers copying the medieval writers in all such themes and subject matter. So, they are similar and at the same time different in theme, subject matter, treatment, outlook, etc. And the language was evidently modern, and we also find that in the poetic expressions of the Elizabethan period, we do not find the limitations of the medieval English. It's the language is more secular, the language is freer, and it's also closer to modern English. And we also find a tremendous shift from the narrative poetry of the earlier times towards a lyrical kind of poetry. And what is lyrical poetry? It's a kind of poetry which talks about the observations and feelings of a single speaker. Throughout the Elizabethan times, we find this kind of lyric poetry dominating the scene. And the most popular lyric poetry form was that of the sonnet, and sonnets were basically short poems which were written to one person or poems written on a single theme. And there was also this kind of poetry known as pastoral poems, about which we will shortly see more in detail. So, what were sonnets? Sonnets were the most important kind of poetry which was beginning to be written from the Elizabethan period onwards, but this does date back to the times of Dante and Petrarch. So, in that sense it had an Italian origin. But in the 1500s and especially in the 1590s, one can say that it was a heyday of English sonnet in England, and we find sonnet becoming more popular than it ever was during the medieval times or even in Italy during the times of its origin. So, English sonnet was popularized obviously by Shakespeare, as we have seen in the earlier sessions also that he was the most important figure, that he left his mark not just in drama but also in all kinds of genres and all kinds of literary expressions which were available during that time. So, Shakespearean sonnet had this particular form. It had 3 quatrains and a closing couplet, and it was in that sense a little different from the sonnets of the Italian origin. And Spenser also modified the kind of sonnet in such a way that it came to be known as Spenserian stanza itself, and this comprised of a 9-line single stanza. So, in what way this was written? It was the sonnet comprised of 14 lines. It was written in iambic pentameter. We also saw what an iambic pentameter was when we talked about a blank verse, and there was also a strict rhyme scheme in place for all the sonnets. And these were the major English sonneteers: Sir Thomas Yat, Henry Howard, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. And Thomas Yat and Henry Howard, they wrote even before the time of Elizabeth, but however they were hugely popular, as we also noted in one of the previous sessions about the huge popularity that Stottel's Miscellany had. The kind of success that Stottel's Miscellany had enjoyed during that period. And Henry Howard is also credited to have invented the English sonnet rhyme scheme, which later was hugely popularized by Shakespeare and other kinds of writers. And in this session, we will be primarily talking about three major figures: Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare, and these were the ones who popularized the sonnet form in Elizabethan England. And what had been happening to the sonnet before this? We mentioned right at the outset that from the 1500s onwards, sonnets did exist in England, and Stottel's Miscellany does provide a lot of evidence to the existence and popularity of sonnets. But however, sonnets by the mid 1500s, many thought that it was already a spent genre, and there was nothing more to be done about this particular form of writing. It was also dismissed as a minor form, and many writers did not want to experiment in the form of sonnet. And we also noticed in the discussion of the university wits that drama was considered more important, theatre was considered more profitable, and that was a kind of artistic expression which ensured more reputation and more visibility as well. So in that sense, sonnet did not enjoy that kind of attention from the Elizabethan writers of that period. And also in the 1560s, there were a few sonnets which thematically was more theological in nature, that also did not get much cultural traction, because the theological expression in art and other literary forms was kind of going down because of the influence of English Renaissance and English Reformation. And sonnet form was also seen as too feminine, and it was not seen as a masculine kind of art for any of the artists, mostly men, for them to pursue. And another problem was that this was associated with the Catholic countries because of its Italian origin. So English being Protestant in nature, it was more or less considered as blasphemous to pursue a form that originated in one of the Catholic countries. And this form was also considered too artificial for English language. So if these sort of problems were associated with sonnets in the 1500s, what exactly happened that changed the status of the sonnets altogether? One of the easiest responses would be to say that, and then Philip Sidney happened. So what exactly did Philip Sidney do to the sonnet form? This is something that we will take a detailed look at shortly. And before that, it's very important to state that until the time that Philip Sidney began writing the sonnets, sonnet was not considered as a form of much repute, and it was also not considered as a major form which could be pursued in terms of serious literature. But with the advent of Philip Sidney and his entry into the sonnet form, we find that almost everyone in England who could hold a pen was writing a sonnet. It was generally said that every Elizabethan man of some kind of an education and some kind of reputation, he used to walk around with a sonnet written and kept in his pocket, ready to read it out to an audience at the slightest provocation. So this was a kind of popularity that the sonnet form enjoyed in the Elizabethan period, especially during the later phase of the century. Now it's very important to look at the kind of poetry that existed even before Spenser being the most definitive literary movement that happened in the Elizabethan times. So two writers are of much significance and much importance, they being Thomas Sackville and George Gascoigne. And we heard about Thomas Gaskell also in the sessions when we talked about drama, because he was more famous for having produced the tragedy Gorboduc. So his poem, The Induction, it was written in 1563. This is considered as the finest single poem between Chaucer and Spenser. This also gives us this impression that after Chaucer and before Spenser, there was hardly any poet of supreme importance that English literary history has had to reckon with. Another poet was George Gascoigne, and his work Steel Glass was considered as the first regular verse satire written in English. And after this, we move on to the most important poetic figure of this time, Edmund Spenser. He lived from 1552 to 1599. The exact date and place of his birth is unknown, and very little is known about his family, what his parents did, how many siblings he had, and these kind of details and how he spent his childhood, etc. are not very known. But however, it is assumed that he did receive an education befitting his social class. So though he was not born into the nobility, or he did not enjoy that kind of favors, we do find him getting a proper kind of an education and rising into prominence in London at a very young age itself. And why is Spenser very important for us when we talk about the Elizabethan period? It is generally said that the opening of the golden age is with the publication of Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar in 1579. So in that sense, though Queen Elizabeth assumed a crown in 1558, only by 1579, and with the publication of Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar, we find the age turning into a golden age of literature. And Spenser's importance continued to live on even in the later centuries. Charles Lamb later on talked about him as a poet's poet, and Spenser had also had a lot of regard for the kind of poetry that existed in England even before his times, and he was the one to talk about Chaucer as the well of English undefiled. So in that sense, we find in Chaucer all the finer things of medieval poetry getting recreated, and we also find him lending to English poetry a very modern structure and a modern kind of thought. And Spenser is considered as the greatest non-dramatic poet, the greatest dramatic poet being Shakespeare himself. And he had an education in Cambridge which left a lot of Protestant influence in him, and we find it getting reflected very strongly in his writings and also in his outlook towards life, politics, and his general attitude towards the ways in which England and Ireland was then positioned as well. So his stint in Ireland is very important. In 1580, we find Spenser assuming a position of much importance. He is sent to Ireland on an official purpose as a secretary to the Lord Deputy. And he was not very happy there. Though he went to Ireland on an official purpose, we find that even after the official visit is over, he stays on for reasons unknown, but he was an unhappy man over there. And Hudson talks about this in such a way that he was miserable among a lawless people whom he loved. So he never was fond of Ireland or of the Irish ways of life, and he even wrote about it much later in 1596 in this short prose piece known as View of the Present State of Ireland, and there he defended the brutal oppression of the Irish by the English monarchy, and he even suggested that systematic starvation and exile be inflicted upon those Irish who do not submit to the monarch of England. So we find him exhibiting a supreme sense of loyalty to the English monarch, and also finding a lot of fault with the Irish. And this is also the beginning of the colonization and the beginning of a different sense of national pride being created in England. So we find Spenser taking advantage of this, or rather being a victim to all of those political changes which come about. In fact, some of the historians are of the opinion that someone who held such extreme opinions about politics, about the colonization, and about the definitions of loyalty to a particular monarch, it's very difficult to imagine that he is the same person who wrote a very fine poem like Fairy Queen, where nothing of this sort of violence come into display. Another important note as an aside, if you notice the spelling of View of the Present State of Ireland over here, it's spelled as V-E-U-E. So we also begin to see that spelling had not yet become standardized even during the Elizabethan times. There are different moves being made to make spelling, grammar and language standardized, but we do find that each author continues to use certain kinds of spelling according to his whims and fancy, and some of these spellings, these errant spellings in the title, they continue to be retained even in the contemporary. So what happens in Spenser's life soon after that? It's quite tragic. By 1598, there's a rebellion that breaks out in Ireland. By this time, it's also useful to remember that there was an ongoing hostility between England and Ireland, which continued even into the 20th century, and later on also in literature, especially when we talk about modernist literature and the Celtic revival, we find a lot of this being revisited as well. And let me also take this opportunity to remind you that all of these, the tussle between Ireland and England, it dates back to the the Celtic period and how the Celts were driven out by the Anglo-Saxons. So, all of these historical elements need to be seen in continuity in order to see the connections and particular kinds of politics getting activated at different points of time. So, in 1598, with this rebellion that breaks out in Ireland, Spencer is forced to return to England, and he comes back a very miserable man. He is quite friendless over there, and he also finds it quite difficult to get back to the normal life in England. But at the same time, something very unfortunate also follows very soon. He returns to England sometime around December 1598, and in January 1599, in perhaps a little more than a month, he dies in an inn at a fairly young age of 46. So, Spencer, though he did not live for a long time in England, though most of his poetic works were getting constructed while he was in exile in Ireland, we find that he had built up a good reputation in England, and when after his death, we find his coffin being carried by fellow poets through the streets of London, and we do find a sense of mourning in London during this time. And he was also buried along with the other poets of his similar repute at the Westminster Abbey. So, talking a little more about Spencer's poetic career, as we mentioned earlier itself, Shepherd's Calendar, a pastoral poem, was his first work, which also inaugurated the Elizabethan Golden Age. And he was only 27 years old then, and this was dedicated to Philip Sidney. With him, he forged a friendship during his younger days itself. And his supreme work, which is considered as the best poetic work of the Elizabethan times, that was written in Ireland. It's a set of 5 books, and it is almost like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in that sense. It's very vast and expansive, and some of its parts are still unfinished. And it's said that he published Fairy Queen with the assistance of Walter Raleigh, who had encouraged him to continue to write and also made all of his works public. And 2 of these works, Amority and Epithalamion, they were written during his relationship with Elizabeth Boyle, whom he married a little later. So, Amority is a set of 88 sonnets which talks about his love towards his lady love. And Epithalamion is described as the noblest wedding hymn in English, and soon after this we also find him getting married to Elizabeth Boyle. This is all is important about Spencer's poetry. Now we move on to discuss the second most important figure, Sir Philip Sidney, who lived from 1554 to 1586. He, unlike most of the other writers of those times, he was born into the nobility, and he was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester's nephew. And Robert Dudley was a very important figure during the Elizabethan times. He was a courtier, and he is more renowned as a very close friend of Elizabeth I. And there's this rumor that Elizabeth I considered him as a suitor for a very long time, though we all know that she continued unmarried until the end of her life. And so Dudley, at a later point, he grows out of the Queen's favour, and he's banished from the court. So all of those details are currently not very important for us, but at the same time very important to note that being the nephew of Robert Dudley did give a lot of mileage to Philip Sidney, and even otherwise his noble lineage did provide him a kind of entry into the many circles, the courts, and a lot of political powers during that time. So, Philip Sidney, even during his lifetime, was considered as the perfect Renaissance gentleman, and his career was very varied. He was a soldier, a courtier, and a poet, all rolled into one. He was knighted in 1583 by the Queen herself. And in him, many contemporary writers and even later historians, they find that he embodied the medieval virtues of the knight, the lover, and the scholar. So, this reflection is found in his writings as well. And he was also a patron. In fact, he himself, and along with his sister, they were the patrons of a number of artists and writers during the Elizabethan time. And he was also considered as a complete courtier poet. In fact, if we trace the history of English literature, we do not find many courtier poets like him, who is a complete embodiment of all kinds of virtues. He had the military and diplomatic prowess, but he was not a scheming politician like many used to be during those times, and that also made him hugely popular, not just within the court but also among the common people. And he was Protestant to the core, and his English roots and his English noble lineage were also quite undisputed. And there is this saying about Philip Sidney that one could not get more English than him. So, in every sense he was this perfect figure who enjoyed a lot of reputation during this time, and once he began writing, that also became the order of the day. And he was elected as a member of the parliament at the age of 18. He was quite young when he assumed various positions of power and prominence. He also had this opportunity to travel to distant places such as France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Austria and Hungary, and during those days to be able to travel, to be able to see new kinds of lives and new kinds of worlds, it was seen as a rare opportunity which also helped him to produce the kind of poetry and lead the kind of life that he was leading. His death was also very heroic. He died in 1586 after the Battle of Zutphen, and there's this anecdote about him which the veracity of which is quite disputed, that he sacrificed the last of his water supply to a wounded soldier. So even after his death, his heroism was quite significant, and he continued to be talked about in London circles for a very long time. And talking about the literary career of Philip Sidney, he was the one who set the literary tone in England. He also initiated something known as the literary clubs, where he brought together many other writers of many other like-minded writers of similar reputation, and the early form of the literary clubs could be seen over there. And some of his major works include Astrophel and Stella, which was published in 1591, and Arcadia, a prose romance, about which we will shortly take a look at. An apology for poetry was very significant in establishing English as a literary language. This was published in 1579 as a response to Stephen Gossen's attack on the poetic expressions and the Gossen's attack on the morality of the stage, so on and so forth. So, Philip Sidney wrote Apology for Poetry in order to show that one could do literature not just in Latin but also in English. This work was very important, and the students of literary criticism would also know that this work is one of the fundamental works which had laid the foundations of English literary criticism for many centuries to come. Now we begin to look at William Shakespeare and his poetic works, and we begin to see that just like Shakespeare dominated the dramatic scene, there is a way in which he begins to dominate the poetic scene as well. His sonnets were a set of 154 sonnets, quite vast, just like his dramatic output, and but the set of sonnets, they were not published until 1609, when a publisher of much repute, Thomas Thorpe, undertook this responsibility. And most of his sonnets, they have a mysterious nature built into them. They were all dedicated to one Mr. W.H., whose identity remains unknown, and also most of the poets, most of these sonnets were also addressed to a young man, and later sets of sonnets addressed to a dark lady. The identity of these people are quite unknown, and this also continues to fascinate many historians and literary critics as well. There are various theories as to who this young man and this young lady, this dark lady could be, and there are various conjectures and various rumors about Shakespeare's sexual orientation and what comes through in his sonnets and so on and so forth. But however, we do not delve into these matters at this point, as it's a dangerous tendency to read a lot of biography into the poetic expressions of any artist. So, let's take a quick look at some of his very popular sonnets, one being Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, another one My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. If you read through these sonnets, you would find that he was capable of different kinds of emotions and different ways of talking about love. If we spend a little time taking a look at some of these verses, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, so on and so forth. And in contrast, we find another sonnet talking about love in a very unconventional way and talking about beauty in a quite a radical sense. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow upon her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses seen I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. So here we begin to see that he was capable of talking about love sarcastically. He was capable about talking about a very traditional, conventional kind of love, and also about a radical sarcastic kind of expressions about beauty, about love, so on and so forth. So much for the versatility of this man, about whom we have spoken about in at least 2 lectures in the previous sessions. So, apart from this, we shall not be dedicating more time in this lecture to talk about Shakespeare's sonnets. And moving on, there were these other minor poets who also enjoyed a great deal of reputation during the Elizabethan times, 2 of them being Walter Raleigh and Michael Drayton. Walter Raleigh was a very interesting figure during the Elizabethan times. He was credited to have led an extraordinary full political life, and he also embodied this restless spirit of the Renaissance. He wanted to travel, he wanted to do different kinds of things, he wanted to live life to the full in the way that the Renaissance England had enabled everyone. And he is best known as the person who travelled to America and colonized Virginia in the New World. Virginia was the name given to the island after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. And he was also Queen Elizabeth's favourite in the court. He was an adventurer, he was a poet, he was an adventurer and a poet rolled into one, and he was continued to be a favourite of Queen Elizabeth I until he fell in love with Elizabeth Throckmorton, the Queen's lady in waiting. And we find him growing increasingly out of favour with the Queen, and he also ends up being banished from the court. And at a later time, in fact, during King James I's reign, the entire fortunes fall, and he was also convicted of treason. He is publicly executed. So, some of those things we shall come back to look at again when we talk about the Jacobean times. And Michael Drayton was another important figure, another important minor poet during this time. It's useful to remember that there were a lot of these minor poets who wrote and who were famous during the Elizabethan times, and there were also songbooks, sonnets, love poems, real and feigned sentiments. So, there was a kind of variety available in the poetic scene. They also spoke about powerful patriotic feelings, and some of them even undertook laborious historical researches to produce a history in verse. And we also find a tendency to imitate, which led to its decline, especially later during the Jacobean times. So, the ways in which the poetry underwent a change in the Jacobean times, we will reserve it for another lecture. And moving on, we quickly take a look at what kind of prose existed during the Elizabethan time. There was a good amount of variety available, with translations, polemic literature, religious and educational tracts, satires, literary debates, criticism, grammar, logic, rhetoric. All of those things were getting discussed in terms of prose. And there were also pamphlets, about which we spoke about when we spoke about the university wits and the kind of pamphleteering career that many of them had undertaken at that point of time. These pamphlets contributed to the rise of English journalism. Right from the 16th and 17th centuries onwards. They were also satiric in tone. So, in that sense, they also responded to the social issues of those times. For example, there were many who wrote about the different forms of entertainment, the kind of morality that was getting displayed on stage, so on and so forth. It also had given rise to a lot of interesting debates between these persons of notable repute, and some of them have also got recorded. One significant one being Stephen Gosson's attack on poetry, and Sidney's apology for poetry as a response. And there was also this time also witnessed a lot of flourishing in terms of criticism and rhetoric, which also laid the foundations of English literary criticism. So, talking about prose, there was a kind of prose which emerged during this time, which was neither prose nor fiction. They have come to be known in posterity as prose fiction, because they were mostly fictitious narratives, and they also had not yet become as mature as a proper novel. So, these were mostly translations from Spanish and Italian romances, and all from Italian novel known as the Italian novella, or even from short stories of those times from different languages and other different cultures. These were found to be hugely popular in England during this time. We also find England responding quite well to the rise of the novel at a later point, and John Lilly was perhaps the most important figure when we talk about this prose fiction during the Elizabethan times. His work Euphues, The Anatomy of Wit, published in 1578, was considered as hugely popular. In fact, it enjoyed such extraordinary popularity that they even in some form could be considered alongside the other dramatic works of Lilly or even Shakespeare. And this popularity led Lilly to come up with a sequel titled Euphues and His England. And the interesting thing about this work, Euphues, is that this did not have a particular storyline. Nevertheless, it was of huge interest to the commoners of those times. And this also led to the emergence of particular style of writing, which is from then come to be known as euphuism. So, how do we define euphuism? If I can give you a couple of sample sentences from John Lilly's Euphues, maybe this would begin to define what euphuism is all about. One sentence goes like this: "As you may suspect me of idleness in giving ear to your talk, so you may convince me of lightness in answering such toys." So, we find a kind of thesis and antithesis at play over here, and also the use of contrast in order to talk about a particular emotion which needs to be conveyed. Another example would be: "Although I have shrined thee in my heart as a trusty friend, I will shun thee hereafter as a trothless foe." We also find him employing alliteration and contrast in order to convey a particular kind of emotion in the form of a dialogue. So, this kind of writing was hugely popular, and even for historical curiosity, we find some of the writers later on also imitating Lilly's style of euphuism. The other writers of this particular form, known as prose romance, were Robert Greene and Thomas Nash. In fact, in one of their works, we also find the earliest example of the picaresque novel, or the novel of rascality, which was later modified and further refined by Daniel Defoe. And Philip Sidney's Arcadia was of supreme importance during this period. It was very popular that many wanted to get a copy for themselves. The interesting thing about this work, Arcadia, is that it's difficult to say whether it belonged to the Elizabethan times or to the later Jacobean times, because it was first written in 1581, but it was properly published only in 1613 during the reign of King James I. This is a work which followed the traditions of the older romances of chivalry, and we also find that unlike Euphues, which did not have a proper storyline, this was more eventful with a lot of historical drama built into this. And coming to the field of literary criticism, we noted earlier also that Elizabethan times laid the foundations of literary criticism in English language and literature. So, what was the need for literary criticism? When we spoke about the Middle Ages, we reiterated that no kind of literature or no kind of artistic tradition can emerge in a place where there is no informed criticism, and whereas there is no free or secular criticism. And with the Elizabethan times, we find that this major gap is being bridged in terms of literature, and we do find the growth of literary criticism, and this becomes important because with the growing stature of a national kind of literature, most of the writers, critics and historians, they begin to realize that there is a need to establish the principles of writing. And this also becomes important because the identity of English literature gets entwined with the identity of England itself. So, it also becomes quite a matter of reputation and historical importance to produce writings which are of supreme quality, and also the need to critique them in order to refine them in a better way in the coming decades and centuries. And this was also another purpose of these growing interest in criticism was to reiterate the status and value of poetry. Let me again draw your attention to people like Stephen Gosson, who felt that art and literature did not serve any purpose in society, and it was considered to simply arouse people's emotions and keep their energy away from any kind of productive activity. So, it was very important to justify the importance of poetry and also to reiterate its status and value in society. And at this juncture, we also find these critics and writers drawing our attention to the importance of the classical models, the merits and demerits of particular kinds of writing, about rhyme scheme, about these various debates about what constitutes poetry, so on and so forth. At this point, again, it is very useful to remember the very famous debate between Spencer and Harvey about what actually constituted poetry. Both of them were friends, they were contemporaries, both of them wrote poetry, but they had different attitudes towards what constituted the structure of poetry. And these sort of friendly debates were very useful in laying the foundations of criticism and also about the principles of literature. The criticism also provided a kind of guide and model to writing, and this was more important because there was a lack of good poetry from the previous century, as we noted right at the beginning. And from Chaucer to Spencer, there were only a couple of poets of note who could be mentioned as noteworthy poets. There was an imminent need to rely on classic poetry, not just from England but also from other traditions and other cultures. So, this also led to a lot of works which began to show the classic models as the proper kind of poetry, and also a way to teach the others to how to write poetry, how to base the principles upon, so on and so forth. So, talking about the rhetoric and literary criticism of those period and the major works of those period, it is important to remember that some of the major writers included Thomas Wilson, Leonard Cox, Richard Sherry, Richard Mulcaster, Richard Carew, etc. And talking about these individual writers is not very significant for us, but the collectiveness of all of this, the understanding that all of them wrote to the contribution of rhetoric and literary criticism during that period is more significant. So, we do not undertake a singular discussion of these individual writers, and as we already mentioned, the Spencer-Harvey debate was a very significant event that that kind of framed the entire understanding of literary criticism during the Elizabethan times. Some of the important works include Gascoigne's Certain Notes of Instruction concerning the making of verse or rhyme in English, William Webb's Discourse of English Poetry, Thomas Campion's Observations in the Art of English Poesy, George Puttenham's Art of English Poesy, and Philip Sidney's Defense of Poesy, which also had an alternate title, An Apology for Poetry. So, if you look at the titles of if you look at the titles and their dates of publication, we see that it is almost around the similar time. They were all contemporaries as well. So, in that sense, along with many other forms of writings, many other forms of performances which were emerging and evolving during this time, we find literary criticism supplementing and complementing the growth of these forms, and also the consolidation of all of these forms in terms of technique, in terms of craft, in terms of principles, so on and so forth. It also had a huge role to play in terms of solidifying the foundations of English literature and criticism right from the times of Elizabeth. And the other important prose writers included Richard Hakluyt, Richard Hooker, Raphael Holinshed, Fox, and Francis Bacon, who continues to be discussed even during the Jacobean time. So, we shall come back to talk about Francis Bacon when we talk about the Jacobean writers. So, when we look at the scene in terms of Elizabethan prose and poetry, we begin to notice that there was a considerable amount of poetry and prose getting written during this time. Even when we were talking about writers who did not enjoy much reputation during those times, or the kind of writers who do not enjoy, or the kind of writers who do not continue to be referred even in the contemporary, their holistic presence and their holistic contribution, it was of singular importance in terms of contribution to literature, criticism about the understanding of poetry, understanding of writing, so on and so forth. And we also find that much of Elizabethan writing, much of Elizabethan culture also owes a lot to all of these writers put together, though some of their supreme examples could be found in individual writers such as Shakespeare, Spenser, Sidney, etc. So, with this we come to an end of this session. So, in the next couple of sessions, we shall be trying to wind up the Elizabethan age itself, talking about the various ways in which the Elizabethan age laid the foundation to the field of English literature, and also talking about what had been happening during this transition time from the Elizabethan period towards the Jacobean period. And since history is not arranged in tidy compartments or in neat compartments, it is important to look at these transitionary phases with more clarity and more interest. And we shall be continuing to do just the same in the following sessions. And with this, we come to an end of today's lecture. Thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you in the next session.